All right. Well, I was going to say this is a great start. I was going to say I'm like hopefully can feed off of a little bit of the different talks that have happened along the way. And you sent me a great. She talks very much about very mechanistic models, and when she mentioned the kind of more generic models, that's a lot of what I work with. Are these ones that have often fewer parameters, but are trying to combine understanding of kind of decision making and optimizing management of invasions. But just to get us started, let's. Oops. Oops. All right, just economics. Yeah, everybody knows this, but it's really important. People are obviously critical for invasive species management. We can think about the ways in which our human activities are affecting invasions. Invasions, in turn, are affecting the values that we can get from our landscape, from the ecosystem services, but that in turn affects how we might, as individuals or jurisdictions or countries, then respond to invasions, and hence, so you got that nice little socio-ecological system going on. And then kind of key to invasions and kind of why they end up being such a challenge is, oops, I'm pushing buttons the wrong way. I'll get the hang of this. All right, is that, in our activities, as we're making choices, we're weighing our costs and benefits, we're thinking about trade-offs of the choices we make. Usually we're not considering the full impacts of the invasive species. Those impacts are spread across entire communities, across the globe, but whoever's shipping their container is not necessarily accounting for all of the risks associated with their trade. And so that, and then plays out, whether you're thinking about carrying your firewood to your campground in order to save money from those expensive little packs of firewood and not thinking about the spread that you might be causing. Or, your friend, you were off traveling and somebody gave you something, put it in your bag and you're bringing it home because, it's kind of special and you want to plant it out and, pose risks to whatever. So we're thinking about these are the external costs of the different human activities. And because of those, that's kind of why we have that need for policy. So just kind of that's the economic perspective that we put on things. And it typically, I think of sort of three general questions that economics can help answer with regards to invasions. And I think that what most people think of, the main one is like, well, what are the impacts? How do we quantify the impacts? And, that can be really important for both bringing attention to the challenge of invasive species. And also, if you can get very kind of understanding of how those damages change with, spread of an invasion or with different abundances, you can then use that to help determine how much investment you might want to make in terms of trying to mitigate those costs. So we've got that kind of feeding into that question of how can we cost effectively allocate our resources to invasive species control. As a government, as like a jurisdiction, we, have our pool of resources that come in. We're choosing not just, do we spend it on controlling this invasive species or this invasive species or this invasive species? It's also being allocated to education, to health, to, safety. There's a lot of trade-offs involved, both at the big, broad context, but then also when thinking about within managing an invasive species, should we be putting more investment in prevention versus eradication of invaders? And the third piece of that, though, is how can policies help align our incentives? So how do we set things up, or as we make choices about how we're going to manage invasive species, how do we do it in a way that actually encourages people to make the right choices, the choices that are better in terms of invasive species outcomes? So hopefully I can make this a little bit more concrete here, but I liked your talk and then Ecky's comment just a minute ago. Models end up being really key when we're thinking about managing invasive species or predicting invasive species, because you don't want to go out there and experiment. You don't want to stick that invasive species and watch it. We get sort of one observation, one chance. And so if we want to test out different options for control, models are really helpful for that prediction, to experiment with different potential control options, or to think about how we can optimize those interventions. So, and then what I'm going to do is just walk through a few examples of the way in which I've used bioeconomic models for thinking about how we can cost effectively control invasions. And I'm going to do that across sort of our safeguarding continuum. So kind of walking through thinking about prevention and then early detection and then control of invasive species. And kind of as I go through, I'm going to talk both about optimizing resource allocation, but then also thinking about how people might respond to those choices of management and how that might affect how we actually want to implement things on the ground. So kind of bridging, hopefully, a bit of those two. And then we'll go back and summarize. So hopefully not taking you on too wild a ride. But usual, think about it. We got over time. We've got the invasion impacts, invasion extent increasing. We've got introduction here. So you have different, you can, prior to the arrival of an invader, you can be preventing its arrival. We've got eradication, early detection, containing or slowing the spread. So thinking about our quarantine or our harvesting, culling around the infested trees to try to slow the spread. We can also think about adaptation or mitigation. You know, once you have your species invaded, you know, I might not be planting ash in my front yard because I don't want to have to then pay for pesticides. But I guess some people will stick to their boxwoods regardless of the pests that might arrive. So, starting with a bit about prevention. This is actually going back to a working group that Sandy and I led. Eki was a part of, and Alberto, you were part of it. There we go. But so again, this came up in one of the earlier talks. The live plants, the importation of live plants is one of the primary modes for introduction of forest pests. You know, what better way to travel than riding on your host plants in temperatures meant to keep you alive? And then one of the things that we kind of thought about is like, what is this structure of biosecurity for importation of live plants? You can think about them, they're being grown in the exporting country and eventually ending up in the importing country. So we have the cultivation and production. It's being shipped, arriving in the ports. The plants, you know, end up getting distributed to the growers and retailers and eventually to consumers, which are down there. And anywhere once you cross this border here, you have that potential for pest or pathogen establishment. But we actually have quite a few safeguards on this pathway, from requiring permits. Yes, you must have, at least in the US, you must have authorization to import specific plants. Oftentimes there are associated treatments that you need to apply. And in addition, there's inspections at the border, potentially treatments if you detect something. Some commodities coming in actually just are required treatments. And then you also have monitoring and surveillance that can help detect if it gets released into the environment. So, and then kind of one of the key things that we ended up digging into was inspections. So this is one of our first safeguards once things arrive. How do we, with all the millions of plants coming in, how do we inspect them and use our resources effectively for that? And then what are the benefits of inspection? There's like three. You know, you might think about it as just intercepting and be able to pull out any infested shipments and keeping them from coming in. But it's also really important for gathering information about the risks of different commodities. So from which countries or which types of genera are most likely to cause impacts, but also deterrence. So if you know your shipments are going to be inspected at the border, you're much more likely to try to produce them in a way that has fewer pests, because getting intercepted and potentially having your shipment destroyed or delayed ends up imposing costs. So we've got sort of these three different benefits of inspection. When we were leading this working group, one of the things that historically APHIS had used a fairly uniform inspection system. So sort of any shipment that came in, they pull out about 2%, take a look at it, and try to make, they're gathering information about them and then hopefully intercepting them. Clearly, you could get more interceptions if you target the riskier commodities more intensively. We did some work where we looked at applying a acceptance sampling model to try to optimize different how you allocate your inspections. But the other thing that we did was kind of drawing from an economic game theoretic framework, trying to understand how you might be able to both target the riskiest shipments, but also further incentivize shippers to clean up their commodities. So we are looking at this risk-based inspection system where you think about categorizing shippers or different genera coming in either to a high-risk group or a low-risk group based upon their prior inspections. And you also had the possibility that if you were really clean for a while, you might be able to move to that low-risk group. The low-risk group gets inspected less often, so you're less cost, both because you have less delay and less likely to be intercepted. So everybody, of course, wants to be in that group. And so we end up setting up a model. It's like it's an economic model where you have the regulators making their choices and the regulators wanting to have a fixed budget. And I want to minimize the number of infested shipments that are accidentally get through that border. And you're choosing how often to inspect the high-risk group and how often to inspect the low-risk group and kind of what's that threshold between them. And then the exporter, on the other hand, is looking at this policy and saying, all right, how much should I invest in cleaning up my shipments before I send them? Because I want to minimize both the cost that I spend on that, and also the cost of getting inspected and the cost of potentially having my shipment intercepted. And so you can set up equations for each of those, and you can then figure out what policy ends up minimizing the amount of infested shipments accepted, given that response that you expect from the shippers. So it's this game theoretic model. And what we end up finding is that by simply shifting from one system to another, you could reduce the amount of infested shipments by about 20%. And it was for this combination of both that you're now targeting those riskier shipments more intensively, but also because everybody wanted to be in that low risk group, everybody cleaned up a lot more. So all shipments were a lot cleaner than they otherwise would be. And so it's kind of a cool thing of thinking about how you combine, simply like a cost effectiveness, where should we stick our, where should we survey, but also accounting for the human behavioral response to it. And so the next one that I want to talk about is, we can think about other pieces along here. Another one, oops.
And then,
I'm getting confused on this thing. There we go. All right.
And then
there we go. All right. So the next one is thinking about, we have all these things that we can do offshore. Either we can say, actually, too risky, you're not allowed to bring that in at all. Or it's so risky, we're going to require this treatment, before you're allowed to bring it in. And any of those things are, if you're putting a prohibition on something, if there's a big enough demand for that commodity, somebody's going to find a way to bring it in. So we can think about how our our prohibitions or offshore treatments, for example, might affect the tendency for unauthorized imports. And the really bad thing about these unauthorized imports is that they're then totally evading all of our risk reduction methods. So you actually pointed this out, right, Christelle, that, if you avoid all these legal requirements, you can have vastly higher infestation rates on like a per plant basis. Obviously, the amount of plants coming in general through legal pathways is going to vastly outweigh how much can actually make it in getting smuggled. But that on a per plant basis, that's going to have much higher risk. And so this is a piece that I've been thinking about a lot. I used AI to make this. I thought this was kind of cool. As somebody who's exporting a plant, I've been actually thinking about this more in a domestic context, about thinking about like citrus moving out of Florida, for example. But you have all these regulations, you have this, all these requirements in order to be allowed to export something. The more and more stringent that gets, the more and more costly it is. At which point, at some point, the costs are going to outweigh the benefits of those exports. And you may instead choose to ship something illegally. There you have the costs of potentially getting caught and whatever penalties are associated with it. And so you can almost think of this in this kind of regulatory context that you've got choices to make about, what is that stringency of that policy and how much enforcement and what kind of penalty might we put in this context to address unauthorized trade. And so we've been looking at this with a theoretical economic trade model, but it's integrated with pest risk. I'm going to just walk you through it real quickly. You can't, of course, see, this is biosecurity stringency. So like how much you have to invest in reducing risk from your commodities in order to allow it to come in. Same thing here. This here, we're looking at import quantity. And here we're looking at pest risk. And so we can think about legal imports. And as you kind of ratchet up those costly prohibitions or the treatments they have to do, you might see this decline in imports because it's just becoming less profitable to import them. And we can think, though, well, what does that mean from a pest risk perspective? Well, not only do you have fewer commodities coming in, but they're also cleaner. Further over here you go. So you have it getting cleaner. Here you're like, well, that's good on a pest risk perspective. You have to think about, well, what does that impact upon consumers? But we got this pest risk. But what actually happens then is that you might, under certain market conditions, so prices are high enough, for example, and maybe penalties and enforcement are not high enough, you end up with this response where you actually have this increase in these illegal imports. And so then we can think about the pest risk from that. And there is no mitigation. And so you don't have this nice, mitigation of the increasing pest risk. Instead, the pest risk is going to just increase with those imports. So then you can think about, well, what is that total pest risk depending upon how you set this stringency? You can also think about it in terms of that stringency or that enforcement. And here you could actually say, from a pest risk perspective only, that it's not optimal to crank up that stringency super high, but maybe it's somewhere in the middle. So this is early work and just things I've been thinking about because I feel like this is a totally underexplored topic area. So obviously that's going to be one of my things I return to is that this might be a place that we want to explore as one of the working groups. And and so how can we maybe predict what are market conditions, for example, or circumstances where you might need to ratchet up that enforcement, for example, or think about what kinds of incentives you might be able to do to offset and encourage people to come through the legal pathway rather than the illegal pathway. Which I just jumped ahead. And you can kind of think about kind of different kinds of smuggling. You can think about the casual traveler who's just bringing home their suitcase and kind of what are the incentives you put in place there. There's things there, we have New Zealand as an example versus, I don't know, there wasn't a whole lot going on as I came through the border. So, you can think about these differences there. You can also think about kind of behavioral tools in those contexts, like kind of what is the signage? What is the messaging? What if you have trash cans right there so you can dispose of your stuff rather than having somebody decide, oh my gosh, I have to go stand in this line because I forgot to take this apple out of my backpack versus being able to be like, oh no, and I get rid of it. You can think about these various different tools. And then you also have kind of the more organized crime, the more organized smuggling. So we have these different things. And I think it's really important to start thinking about how we might be able to quantify how important is this? Thank you. Well, we had a signal. I'm talking too fast. All right. So tied to that, we also can think about how different trade patterns, like different trade technologies, might affect how effective our border security policies are. So we are having this massive increase in e-commerce and our direct-to-consumer trade. That's totally different than all of the commodities that are coming in through ports. How do we think about better managing those? Like, how do we need to change our systems? We have a lot better grasp of sort of the main trade pathways, the wood packaging, but we also have a lot of, whether it's aquarium material or wood products or plant material or seeds coming through the mail from internationally. How might we think about managing those? So it's going to require new tools. And again, here's a place where you might be able to have economic tools. You can think about, we've got regulations. We also might be able to think about the penalties of violating those regulations. You could think about taxes that might be able to be put on these things. You could think about the inspections. But there's also other things that we might be able to do, which are more, again, behavioral tools. And I think when we brought this up at one of the meetings, we were Googling it. And depending upon what country you're in, if you try to order some seeds, you might get a message like this if you're in Australia. Whereas you don't get anything like this popping up if you try to order seeds online in the US. So what is the role? How does messaging, for example, something as simple as that, where you're trying to affect the consumer rather than just the seller of the good, how might we be able to think about design of those in order to reduce risk from this pathway? So again, these are kind of open topics.
And
All
then,
right. So next, I'm doing fine. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about early detection and eradication. So that was all my sort of prevention piece, thinking about optimizing those inspections, and then thinking about some of these new pathways of prevention that we need to be starting to tackle. The next thing is, obviously, it's not cost effective to prevent everything from coming in. We're never going to. So early detection is obviously a key component of that. And this, I don't need to say this really to this crowd, but earlier detection has value because if you detect things earlier, chances are it's going to be less widespread. You're going to be able to, if you attempt to eradicate it, you're going to have higher likelihood of success. It'll be less costly. You're able to maybe slow the spread sooner, put a quarantine in place. You also have more time then to do the research and the adaptation, figure out what is this biological control. Like the sooner you find out that it's there, you have a whole lot more options in terms of management. And so one of the questions that I've asked in some of my work is, well, what does that mean in terms of how much and where should we survey? If we're going to be putting surveys out on the landscape to detect species early, where should we be doing that? How should we be doing that? And that's kind of recognizing there's huge heterogeneity, both in terms of where things are going to arrive, where they're going to survive, and kind of what is that habitat? What is the habitat? The resources at risk, for example. So more coarse perspective, but kind of I draw on models. I draw on parameters such as the things that come out of Christelle's models to help parameterize the types of things that I do. And we also have many different pests. They have different attributes. They have different spread rates. They have caused different types of damages. They have different control methods, different efficacy of those control methods, different lures, different ways of detecting them. Some of them are super sensitive. We're pretty good at detecting spongy moth, but maybe a lot less so, where you have a lot more delay with some of the wood borers and bark beetles. So you have all of this different heterogeneity. And so given that, how can we take what we know about some of these different organisms to think about how we might want to allocate our survey resources across the landscape? And maybe you think about it within a single site, that, if you think about the density of surveys at a single site, obviously the costs of those surveys are going to go up. The more you put out, the more. But the idea is that if you're putting the more traps you put out, the earlier you detect it, and then hence the less the expected costs are from whatever invaders might arrive. You don't know that they're there until you go out and try to survey for them. So you might be surveying in a place where nothing ever arrives, but you also might be able to detect something. So you have this sort of expected damages curve. And so then you can think about, adding up those. If you want to minimize the total costs of your surveillance plus your expected costs and damages of the invasion, then add those up, and then you figure out, okay, well, we want to implement about this many surveys at this place. How many surveys you might put out at a location is going to depend upon a bunch of different things. How often do you expect a species to arrive? Obviously, the more often that it arrives, then you're going to get a greater return on investment from your surveys. There's also the more damages. The closer it is to high impact areas where it's going to spread to sooner, you're going to have more benefits from surveys. The model that I use here, I decided just to skip the details, but it's very different than the types of models we were talking about this morning. In this case, I have a very simple model of spread where you're thinking about spread over time as kind of just measured as an increasing area occupied. And damages are associated with the extent of invasion. That can vary heterogeneously across the landscape. And you're putting surveys out on the landscape. And the question is, what is the probability that one of the traps that you put out on the landscape or a survey you put out on the landscape is going to both intercept a species that has established and be successful in actually detecting it, depending upon how good, for example, that lure is. And obviously, that's also going to depend upon, you're going to be more likely to detect a population that's on the landscape for a while because it's bigger than one that, for example, is smaller. So we have this model. It's an age class model of invasion spread, very simple kind of model of spread. And the idea is that in that model, depending upon the size of that population, when you detect it, you're going to then respond in terms of either trying to eradicate it, maybe successfully or unsuccessfully. You might slow the spread, or if it's too widespread, you might be doing nothing. So you actually have this endogenous response to the invasion, depending upon the size when it's detected. So we've applied this in the first paper. This is actually out of the first working group. This is when I was like a nice little grad student, and we did apply this to the case of spongy moth across the U.S. Or actually, I guess this was we were looking at spongy moth and its impacts, and we're trying to figure out where you should allocate surveys across California. So spongy moth is not established on the West Coast, but it arrives periodically. You have differences in terms of the cost of trapping, but also a huge variability in terms of probability of establishment or arrival in any given county. And so we applied this model to think about optimal surveys in order to eradicate new populations of spongy moth. And so we looked at a bunch of kind of different comparisons. One is simply, well, what happens if you just allocated your resources uniformly versus, for example, if you actually optimize where you should put your surveys out on the landscape across all the different counties. And you save money by actually being strategic about it. Not too surprising. You can then look at, well, what if we have a budget constraint? We can't survey as much area. So we looked at a whole bunch of different scenarios, trying to understand how different attributes of the species, for example, affect how much surveillance you might be doing. Then got to work with, that was the first time I think I got to work with you, Eki, was on this paper here, where we then applied it thinking about, like, what if we're thinking about surveying for suites of species? So wood borers and bark beetles that might arrive in New Zealand and threaten both their plantation forests and their urban trees. And so we had, did work with this, thought about arrivals in each of the different forest ports, and then looked at the expected net benefits of implementing surveys. So depending upon the number of traps that you deploy across New Zealand, what are the expected net benefits? So the reduction in our expected damages, costly damages from the invaders by having that surveillance system out on the landscape. And so I've since done, applied in a few different contexts, looked at some bark beetles in the continental US and European grapevine moth, which is an agricultural pest that arrived and has been eradicated once in California. How much should we be surveying in case it comes back? This is a new current fun project working in Switzerland to look at surveys for priority quarantine pests. And so we have some interesting things that we've been learning about kind of how different species attributes might affect our surveys. And then we also had looked at some of the things about, well, trade-offs between, if you're surveying for a whole bunch of different species, should you be using specialist lures that might be really good at detecting those really high impact things versus generalist lures that can maybe detect a broader suite of things, different costs. So we have some work that just came out on that. But big challenge, parameterizing these models are very hard, especially you're trying to come up with these species, or you're thinking these are often species that you might not know a lot about, trying to get these spread rates for species. One of the things we've been trying to work in this model is we have huge uncertainty in a lot of these parameters. How important is that? How much does that change actually what we would do? So using value of information in some of these models to kind of assess how bad is how impactful is our uncertainty. But I see this as kind of, there's ways to draw on all the work that you're doing, to try to help think about what are some of these generalized parameters? Like, what can we have a parameter, like a database of information that we have about species? We can go and look, we dig into different estimates in different locations. Is there any way to kind of bring those together in a way that makes it easier to have, like, rapid response, for example, just very coarse model of like, what are we working with here? What is the breadth of spread rates for things within a particular group? Anyways, I'm not the biologist, I'm the economist. But I think that there is room to be able to kind of try to bring together more information, or kind of the ranges of information about some of these different parameters that go into these models. But we also are able to show, the effects of spread rate. The faster the sign's spreading, obviously, you need to get in there and detect it earlier. So, you have greater benefits from, and damages accrue faster, so they're more costly in general. So spread rate, you tend to want to do more surveys. If you have a high spread rate, higher eradication costs in general, you're going to want to be able to detect earlier. Higher introduction rate definitely ends up meaning that you're going to want to have greater surveillance, higher damage costs. Another really interesting one that I've been digging into recently is this probability of detection by the public. We were talking all about putting out formal surveys on the landscape, but then we have our homeowner that notices their dying boxwood and calls their local arborist, and maybe that's how we learn about a new pest that's arrived. And when you think about it, it's like how much you want to invest in surveys is going to depend in part upon, well, what happens if you don't survey? How quickly are you going to learn about it from reporting from the public? And so that's kind of been one of the new things that I've been looking at. And every time a new pest, potentially damaging pest, is detected in the US, there's this new pest advisory group that goes out and does a report. I was able to get all of the new pest advisory group reports for new incursions in the US from 2010 to 2018, and did this crazy sleuthing game to figure out how each of them were first reported. And it was like a mystery, like a scavenger hunt of information. We didn't get everything totally perfectly worked out, but we have like general agency monitoring, we have industry inspections, commodity inspections, trapping surveys. There's a little bit of overlap between these trapping surveys and some of the agency monitoring, but research extension, operators, this is where we're thinking about like farmers and nursery owners, for example. So kind of business owners who might be out there. And then we have the general public, which might be the person going out and looking at our petunias and noticing that they're dying. And so we ended up finding that somewhere between essentially a quarter and 60% of species were first reported by either a member of the public or by, your farmer or nursery owner, for example. And we have some examples of species, although this one's questionable. I've heard different things about spotted lanternfly, but European great vine moth was reported by a vineyard owner, and what's it now named? The giant hornet. I forget it. Changed its name. Giant hornet. Somebody went out on their front porch and was like, "Oh my gosh, what's this giant hornet?" And then they had seen a YouTube video about it and ended up calling. Anyways, so we've got public reporting playing into here, and we dig into this, and this one's for you. There's 6 of the detections in here were by landscapers, essentially, or arborists, somebody in that category, which, it's kind of highlights the really important role that they play when you think about kind of the training, or how do you navigate that as terms of regulations for reporting versus, again, maintaining that trust with homeowners so that you can be out there managing it. So this tied into different cultural intensities or benefits of or tendencies to do reporting, where in New Zealand, you have this whole culture of knowing about invasive species and a hotline, and it's legally required that you report new pests. And so here, it's our general public category. And in the US, somewhere between, these are the proportion of confirmed detections in the US versus in New Zealand. And so we have the public is playing a greater role in New Zealand. than it is in the US currently. So that suggests that there's room for better leveraging those. And when we think about this, again, there's these different structural things that we can do. Again, try to find a hotline, like a general hotline in the US to call for. No, you go online, you're like, okay, do I go to my cooperative extension? You try the APHIS number, it doesn't work. I've tried it. There's, so there's not a clear system. Maybe everybody should have a refrigerator magnet on their fridge, which is like your one place. But we can also think about, incentives. Sometimes you might have an incentive not to, like, oh, I report this, they're going to come down and cut down my tree or my forest. So there's also that fear. How do we manage that? We got the training, which you guys do a good training, but there's probably wide variability in terms of the training of different arborists or different landscapers. How do we set the social norms in a way that people are, induced to want to report things? And then there's also this idea, we have iNaturalist and all these different apps. I think there's huge ability to leverage that going forward. And there's even these ideas about, gaming, like how do you get people to kind of be logging things more often by harnessing everybody's interest in a game. So let's see. I'll figure this out by the end of the presentation, going the right way. All right, I'm going to just talk a little bit about containing invasions and slowing the spread. And one thing to note is that, my model of optimal surveillance, it has kind of built in this like optimal response. Like once you detect it, something about the species and its size, should you eradicate, should you not? We're doing some work incorporating that sort of value of information in there. Like if you have huge uncertainty about all of those things, how does that affect your ability to effectively make the decision of, do we attempt eradication or not? And so we got that, but we've also been working on some other strategies for, thinking about an invasion spreading on the landscape. And, it's pretty, you can do simulation models, for example, if you have a pretty detailed model of spread. We also did some work thinking about how network metrics might be able to be used to help target controls in landscape. So if you think about it, if you have a place that's this primary node of dispersal, like if the invasion gets there, it's going to spread everywhere. That be able to identify those types of locations can be really important for knowing that's the place you either want to keep it from arriving from or be able to detect it quickly if it arrives, for example. And so we did some work. This was actually in the case of boater inspection stations across lakes in Minnesota. And, we set up the whole set of lakes as these nodes that are connected by boater movements, and then used different network metrics and compared it to an optimal control strategy to try to identify it. And we found that some of the network kind of metrics, these kind of measures of connectivity, could be really useful for helping with some of that targeting. And this is, we're like working with huge numbers of lakes, which means kind of suggests that you could think about it in the context of huge numbers of forest patches, for example. So another one, I'm not going to get into this too much, but I mean, this whole idea of uncertainty, like we detect something, we don't know how widespread it is. We don't know much about that. We don't know the efficacy of different controls. You have stochastic variability, depending on what the weather happens to be, whether it's going to spread really quickly or really more slowly. But one of the things that a team of us got together was just thinking about, what is this kind of a framework for thinking about, bringing stakeholders together? What are our objectives for managing an invasion? How do we, use kind of structured decision making to outline kind of what is that context? What are our different options for control interventions? What do we care about? What do we need to be considering? Bringing that together with, for example, bioeconomic modeling, accounting for our different types of uncertainties, optimizing, going out and implementing management. And the other piece is going back and monitoring your results and working to adaptively manage. So responding, like, at what point, like you've dug in, you said you're going to eradicate something and it's failing, but you don't want to quit because it's really hard to quit something that you started. What if you had an actual adaptive management approach to tell you, like, this is when you quit and you go and you switch to a new strategy? So one kind of last thing is kind of, again, this, might think, like, we could we're going to control this invasion that's spreading on the landscape. We see it spreading here. We're going to try to slow its spread because we don't want it to go over here where you have this endangered species. You don't want to get affected. And all well and good until you realize, actually, this landscape's made up of a whole bunch of people. And whose property is it? Who's actually making the choices about whether to control that invasion? Their choice whether or not to control the invasion on their landscape or allow somebody to come on their land to control it is going to have consequences for spread to neighboring lands. And so trying to make decisions about how to optimally control something without actually thinking about all the actual individual decision makers who each have different objectives. Somebody might be oblivious or think that bamboo looks beautiful and it's a great sound barrier. And then the person next door, like, this bamboo is like tearing up my foundation. And then there's the invaded forest. So you have to think about how you're making these decisions within these landscapes of, you think of management mosaics. So you have all these different decision makers on the landscape. And we did some work actually like surveying, this isn't a case of ranchers, but looking at yellow star thistle spread with ranchers. And we're actually talking to them like, well, what do you do, when your neighbor has invasive species? Some of them are like, we gotta give up, throw our hands in the air, we give up. We're going to control less because no matter what we do, it's going to keep coming on there. Others like sit there and spray at their fence line all of the time. Others actually would leap the fence at night and control the weed on their neighbor's land. And then there was actually the subset who would get together and collaborate. They'd hire somebody together to go in and control the invasion. And so you can think about these different kind of cooperative responses. How do we how do you deal with the one landowner who isn't going to let anybody on their land and has no incentive to control the invasion versus how do we maybe set up incentives or think about kind of the social context for controlling things. And then kind of looping back to the very beginning, you can also think about this in more of a global context. Kind of this idea of cooperation, thinking about spread between jurisdictions. So you can think about spread between different countries, for example. And, we know that there's huge variation in terms of the phytosanitary requirements across different countries, for example. But as an invasion spreads to a new location, it's then this bridgehead population, and you have that much more likelihood of it moving somewhere else. So what does that mean in terms of also thinking about our role into perhaps helping support other countries to reduce the likelihood of invasions establishing there? Like, how can we think about that cooperative control in that global context, not just in the landscape context? And I think, so now I get to the summary. So this is my attempt to just kind of show ways in which bioeconomic models can try to help kind of suggest optimal control strategies to provide some decision support, with obviously parameterization being a challenge. I think there's also a real I'll get to my real opportunities in a moment. And they're relevant from prevention to control. They're really helpful for thinking about different trade-offs. What are you giving up in different contexts? And that the efficacy of these policies or any control almost always is going to end up depending upon how people respond to those or embrace those policies. So thinking about human behavior is going to be pretty important throughout. And this idea of systems perspective, we need to think not just about those ecological interactions, but also those people interactions and the people-species interactions. All right, and so then just kind of wrapping up my kind of synthesis opportunities, some of the things that I think as kind of going forward are opportunities. One is that idea, unauthorized trade. I think it'd be really interesting to try to learn, like, maybe it isn't that big a deal. Maybe it is a really big deal. I don't think we have a really good sense of it. Like, in which context do we particularly need to be worried about that? Same thing with these new trade technologies, thinking about managing things such as e-commerce and direct to consumer. What level of risk are those posing, and what does that mean for how we might want to adapt how we're managing them? So I think there's so much work being done out there in terms of trying to understand species and their spread and the control efficacy. There's lots of these different databases talking about these things in different places. If there's some way to kind of bring those together so they're more available for perhaps linked with some of the different decision support models that are available to make it easier to have those accessible for species. Also, kind of this idea of synthesizing what are our suite of tools in order to deal with the people problem? It's not just economic incentives, it's not just regulation. There's a whole lot of different things that you can do. We call these like structural tools, which can be things like, you're taxing somebody, for example, or having economic consequence. But it also can be that putting that trash can there at the gate of the airplane with a reminder to get rid of your apple before you enter the country. You have all these different physical things that you can do, but then also these social norms or these messaging, what are these tools that we have? I think it'd be really cool to synthesize some of those tools in the context specifically of invasive species. So obviously, you think about expanding these control, not just looking at prevention or control in the landscape, but thinking a lot more about that continuum and how your control choices at one part of that safeguarding continuum affect your choices elsewhere in terms of cost-effective management. So I think also a lot, value of information and adaptive management, where we're trying to embrace this uncertainty and understand how we can better manage in the face of that uncertainty is, an area we need to keep going. And stakeholder engagement. I think this was really helpful for what are the questions that we actually want to answer? What needs to be answered? What's keeping kind of blocking our progress? And I think oftentimes having the different decision makers in the room as you're developing projects can be really helpful for guiding that work to be more actionable. And that's that. And I have to say thank you for this workshop, and thank you there's lots of people here who helped me do all this research, both as collaborators but also as mentors. So thank you. I'm grateful to everybody.